Welcome to the Embracing You podcast with your host, Eric Pothen. We are all on our own unique journey to discovering ourselves. Each episode, I will help you navigate the journey within to reconnect with and discover the innate love you have for yourself. This podcast will cover topics from self-love to eating disorders and body image to mental health and to overall well-being. My goal is to help you honor and embrace yourself so you may live your most authentic life. Let's dive in. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Embracing You podcast. And if this is your first time listening, I just wanted to welcome you to the Embracing You podcast. It was super exciting to be able to put out the first episode for you all, and I am incredibly excited to dive into today's episode. I wanted to spend the next couple of episodes of this podcast with you all just talking about a couple of key concepts, practices, tools, whatever you want to call them, that will really enable you to dig deep as you take the journey within. Today, we're going to focus on a practice that I believe is going to be quite essential for us to use as we spend some time together during each episode. Now, this practice doesn't come naturally to many of us, and it really does require a lot of practice to be better at doing it. And this practice is vulnerability. Before we dive into kind of talking about what it means to be vulnerable and how we can be vulnerable, I'd love to just take a moment here to define vulnerability for you all. I'm a big Brené Brown fan, so I thought I would start with her definition of vulnerability, and her definition is as follows: uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's this unstable feeling that we get when we step outside of our comfort zone or do something that forces us to loosen our control. I want you to sit with that definition for a second. What does that definition mean to you? And how does that compare to your own definition of vulnerability? I also put out there on social media a question for you all and asked you to define vulnerability. And I'd like to share a couple of those definitions with you right now. One person said, vulnerability is the ability to share a part of yourself with others, knowing it might end up hurting yourself. Someone said vulnerability is authentically offering oneself to another emotionally with the risk of rejection. And a final definition I wanted to share with you all today of vulnerability is being willing to be your authentic self no matter the cost. I mean, if I'm just thinking back to Brené Brown's definition, you all have just a little bit of her within each one of you, because you touched on several parts or points to her definition, but I think there's a common thread really between all of these definitions that I just read for you, and that common thread is authenticity. And really, in order for us to be vulnerable with another human being, we first need to be willing to be our authentic self. And whenever we choose to be vulnerable, I believe that there is a risk that we are taking in that moment. We run the risk of rejection of, what we might say to the other person. We run the risk of hurting another person depending on what we are choosing to be vulnerable with them about. We run the risk of not being heard or understood by the other individual. And I think this one is most prominent for me, whenever I'm in this space of choosing to be vulnerable or not, but it's running the risk of being perceived as a burden to others. Just as I read through this list of risks, I find myself thinking, why on earth should we be vulnerable if there are so many risks involved? And for me, if there's no risk involved, then it isn't vulnerability. Vulnerability is about letting your walls down and bearing yourself emotionally to another human being. And vulnerability is being afraid to lay it all out there on the table and to not hold back. Being vulnerable requires risk because once we choose to be authentic and speak from within, it no longer becomes our responsibility for how the other person or people interpret what we share with them. I think for me personally, I try to take all of the blame and responsibility for the emotional response of others as I'm vulnerable with them. Yes, I think empathy is important, but one thing I've learned in the past 2 years is that it's okay to put yourself first. And you put yourself first when you choose to be vulnerable. You listen to that voice within and honor it. You honor that voice, but most importantly, you honor that voice and your emotions. For me, I know that I have not been the best about honoring my own emotions and that voice within. And when I don't honor those things, it typically results in more inner turmoil and ultimately resentment towards the other individual or individuals involved. Sometimes I don't honor that voice because I despise conflict. Sometimes it's because I resort to people pleasing. Sometimes it's because I don't have the emotional energy to. As I say these things out loud, I'm kind of finding a common thread amongst them. For me, not choosing to be vulnerable for these reasons is because I lack the confidence and trust with my voice and emotions. And I really fail to put myself first, and I am afraid of taking these risks. Keeping those thoughts within and not choosing to be vulnerable holds us back from growth. Because just like with vulnerability, there also needs to be a risk involved in order to grow. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about why we might not choose to be vulnerable and then present a different lens or viewpoint on these reasons and how you can grow from being vulnerable. Number one, being vulnerable is a sign of weakness. Some think that emotionally opening up to others might highlight their faults and insecurities, but let me tell you something here. Being vulnerable is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. Let me say that again. Being vulnerable is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. It is a sign of courage. Because once we can learn to be honest with and trust ourselves, then I really believe we can be honest with others. For me, being vulnerable requires trust, love, and openness. When we choose to be vulnerable, we open up a part of ourselves that has been locked on the inside, but never having had the courage to escape. To be vulnerable is to be strong and courageous. Number two, being vulnerable is too scary. You're right. Choosing to be vulnerable can be terrifying. It can make you feel uncomfortable. Instead of being afraid of the discomfort, doubt, and uncertainty, why don't we choose to lean into it a little more and embrace those emotions rather than running away from them? For me, it's all about learning how to sit with these unwanted emotions and not suppress them. Because for me, I know that whenever I suppress my own thoughts, they always still come back and rise to the surface. When we choose to learn to allow these emotions to be present and then act in accordance to our own voice and emotions, this is where the opportunity for growth lies. Number 3, I don't know how to be vulnerable with others. I think one barrier to this right here is the fact that most times I don't think we even know how to be vulnerable with ourselves. Take a second to think about that. When was the last time you allowed yourself to honor your emotions? When was the last time you allowed yourself to honor that voice within? And when was the last time you didn't honor that voice within because you were afraid of what it was potentially telling you? I really believe that being vulnerable with ourselves also comes with a risk, because when we are vulnerable with ourselves, we allow ourselves to unearth and uncover the truth. And sometimes uncovering this truth might be scary for us. And that's okay. The biggest skill that I think we need in these moments is trust. Trusting ourselves that entering this space will help set us free from a lot of the shame and problems with self-confidence we all have. Honoring and trusting in yourself will allow you to become more confident in about how you show up in this world for others, but most importantly, yourself. And I think that the mind protects and tries to protect us, but also I think the mind tries to protect us too much sometimes. Learning how to be vulnerable doesn't happen overnight, and it really does take time and, most importantly, practice. There will be moments when your mind tries to hold you back. There will also be moments when you do choose to honor that voice within and to be vulnerable with yourself and others. I kind of touched on this in my first episode here, but I hope you know that we're all not perfect, and we're all not perfect at doing life. We all have our faults, we all have our weaknesses, and when it comes to being vulnerable, we need to be able to embrace those parts of ourselves and love those parts of ourselves a little more, and to not be shameful about them. Because when we can let go of some of this shame, that honoring yourself will become so much easier. So, we've just spent a lot of time here together talking about vulnerability. So, let's take a second to talk about why our ability to be vulnerable is an important skill for us to have as we embark on this journey. And the answer to that question, I think, is quite simple here. And it's because taking the journey within is going to require us to dig deep into who we are as a person. And it's going to require us to reflect on who we are and why we operate the way that we do. And on this quest of growth and self-discovery, we're going to be faced with challenges by our thoughts, by our emotions. And it's in this space the noises are going to get pretty loud. This journey will put us face to face with some of our biggest fears and insecurities, and that can be incredibly scary. I'm going to be honest with you here, and as we embark on this journey, your mind is going to create a lot of stories around some of the things that you uncover and learn about yourselves. But if we can learn to release the hold we have on our mind and choose to be vulnerable with ourselves, we will be able to navigate this journey with a little less fear and apprehension, and instead with more courage and strength. We aren't meant to take this journey within alone. There will be moments when things come up for you on this journey that may require you to be vulnerable with others. And I really want you to lean on others and trust your voice within if that is what it is telling you, and if you need to be vulnerable, and if you need to ask for help from others. Because remember, being vulnerable is a sign of strength. It is not a weakness. We all obtain the ability to be vulnerable, but our own minds hold us back from doing so. And if you doubt your ability to be vulnerable and you don't think you are strong and courageous enough to be vulnerable, I'm here to tell you that you are strong and courageous enough to be vulnerable with yourself and others. Please, please, please trust and honor yourself each and every day and allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you are feeling. When you allow yourself to feel, you allow for an emotional release. And what a gift that can be. Well, I am kind of finding that I'm becoming a little bit overwhelmed talking a lot about vulnerability with you all, and I feel like I could sit and talk here for hours about it. But my mind is spinning with different ways that I can continue to practice vulnerability with myself and others, and to continue to push myself to be more vulnerable with myself and others. I think that as you kind of navigate this journey of learning how to be vulnerable, you will also find that understanding and practicing this skill will help you to grow and evolve in ways you never thought you would be able to. I hope this episode prompted some thinking for you all, and I hope this episode leaves you feeling inspired to be vulnerable with yourself and others. And remember, being vulnerable means embracing yourself for who you are each and every day. And remember that this person is strong. This person is resilient. This person is beautiful and a lovable human being. Until next time, I hope you all continue to be gentle with yourselves. You continue to be courageous. You continue to be vulnerable and learn to be vulnerable. And most importantly, I hope you continue to be you. Much love.